The black dress still hung on my bedroom door like a shadow cast by yesterday's grief, its fabric heavy with the weight of finality. I couldn't bring myself to touch it, couldn't bear to fold it away into the walk-in closet where it would wait among my other clothes like a dark omen of future tragedies. The funeral flowers crowded every surface of our master bedroom, their cloying sweetness growing more oppressive with each passing hour as they began their inevitable decay in the September heat that pressed against the windows of our Georgian mansion in Charleston's most exclusive historic district. Serena Washington sat on the edge of the California king bed she had shared with her husband for 18 years, staring at her hands with the hollow-eyed exhaustion of someone who had cried until no tears remained. The 20-carat diamond wedding ring felt foreign on her finger now, a glittering reminder of promises that death had rendered meaningless. The silence in the house was suffocating, pressing against her eardrums like the weight of deep water. For nearly 2 decades, these halls had echoed with the sounds of their life together. Marcus's deep laughter during his evening phone calls with colleagues, the gentle hum of his morning routine as he prepared for another day of saving lives at Charleston General Hospital, the soft jazz music he loved to play while reviewing patient files in his study, even the occasional sounds of their lovemaking that had made her blush even after all those years of marriage. Now there was nothing but the mechanical whisper of the air conditioning system and the distant sounds of traffic on East Bay Street, muffled by the thick brick walls that had been built to withstand hurricanes, but offered no protection against the storms of grief and betrayal that were about to reshape her world forever. The grandfather clock in the downstairs hallway, a wedding gift from Marcus's parents who had died in a car accident 7 years earlier, chimed 11 times. Each note seemed to reverberate through her bones, a reminder that time moved forward whether she was ready or not. Dr. Marcus Washington, renowned cardiovascular surgeon, devoted husband of 18 years, respected member of Charleston's African American elite, had been buried exactly 27 hours and 43 minutes ago. Serena remembered every excruciating detail of the service at Mother Emanuel AME Church, where she had stood beside the gleaming mahogany casket, accepting condolences from what seemed like half the city. The sanctuary had been packed beyond capacity with colleagues from the medical center, fellow members of their exclusive country club, representatives from the various charities they supported, neighbors from their historic district neighborhood, and dozens of patients whose lives Marcus had saved over his 15-year career. Such a brilliant surgeon, they had whispered to her in voices thick with genuine grief. Only 45 years old, taken in the prime of his life. A tragedy for the entire medical community. He saved my father's life 3 years ago. The world has lost a true healer. The official cause of death was a massive heart attack brought on by an undiagnosed congenital defect. A cruel irony for a man who had spent his career repairing other people's hearts. Marcus had collapsed in his office at the hospital while reviewing surgical schedules for the following week. By the time the other doctors had reached him, he was already gone. The autopsy had revealed a rare genetic condition that affects less than 1% of the population, a time bomb that had been ticking in his chest since birth. Serena had been strong during the funeral, holding her head high as hundreds of mourners filed past to pay their respects. She had worn the black St. John suit that Marcus had bought for her last Christmas, the one he said made her look like a queen. She had spoken briefly but eloquently about his dedication to healing, his love for his patients, his dreams of establishing a free clinic in the city's poorest neighborhoods. Throughout it all, she had maintained the composure and grace that had made her one of Charleston's most admired women, the perfect surgeon's wife who could host elegant dinner parties for 20 while managing a household budget that rivaled some small corporations. But now, alone in the master bedroom of their Ansonboro mansion with the weight of forever pressing down on her chest like a physical force, Serena felt the carefully constructed facade beginning to crack. The woman who had stood so dignified beside her husband's grave was dissolving, replaced by someone raw and broken and utterly lost. She had met Marcus at a medical conference in Atlanta when she was 26 and working as a pharmaceutical sales representative. He was a third-year cardiology resident, brilliant and ambitious, and so devastatingly handsome that she had literally forgotten what she was supposed to be saying during her product presentation. He had approached her afterward, offering to buy her coffee and apologize for disrupting her concentration. "I couldn't help staring," he had said with that crooked smile that would become so familiar over the years. You're the most beautiful woman I've ever seen, and I specialize in studying the human heart. It was a terrible pickup line, but coming from Marcus Washington, 6 feet 3 inches of lean muscle and quiet confidence, with the kind of intense brown eyes that seemed to see straight through to her soul, it had worked perfectly. They had talked for hours in that hotel coffee shop about medicine and literature and their shared dreams of making a difference in the world. By the time she flew back to Charleston, Serena knew she had met the man she was going to marry. Their courtship had been a whirlwind of weekend visits between Charleston and Atlanta, long phone conversations that stretched into the early morning hours, love letters that she still kept in a silk-lined box in her dressing room. Marcus had proposed on Christmas Eve during his first year of cardiac surgery fellowship, presenting her with a vintage Art Deco engagement ring that had belonged to his grandmother and asking her to build a life with him in Charleston, the city they both loved. She had said yes without hesitation, abandoning her promising pharmaceutical career to become the wife of a surgeon who worked 80-hour weeks and earned barely enough to pay his student loans. Those early years had been a struggle financially, but they had been happy in a way that Serena still remembered as the purest joy of her adult life. They had lived in a tiny carriage house apartment behind a mansion on Trad Street, furnishing it with items from estate sales and flea markets, cooking together in the cramped kitchen, while Marcus told her about his cases, and she shared her plans for the interior design business she hoped to start once his residency ended. Money had become less of an issue as Marcus's practice grew and his reputation spread throughout the Southeast. Patients flew in from as far away as Miami and Atlanta to have their hearts repaired by the young surgeon, who combined technical brilliance with an almost supernatural ability to connect with his patients. The grateful family sent gifts, cases of expensive wine, jewelry, artwork, even cars on occasion. Medical device companies courted him with consulting contracts and speaking fees. Other hospitals tried to lure him away with offers that grew more generous each year. Through it all, Marcus had remained grounded, more interested in healing people than in accumulating wealth. It had been Serena who pushed for the bigger house, the luxury cars, the country club membership that would establish them in Charleston's social hierarchy. She had justified these acquisitions as investments in Marcus's career, ways of projecting the success that would attract even more patients and opportunities. But looking back now, she wondered if her ambitions had created pressures that contributed to her husband's death. Had the stress of maintaining their lifestyle, of living up to her expectations, weakened his heart in ways that no genetic test could have detected? The doorbell rang, its deep Westminster chimes echoing through the house like a funeral dirge. Serena lifted her head, frowning. She wasn't expecting visitors. The parade of neighbors bearing casseroles and condolences had finally ended the previous evening, and she had specifically asked her sister Denise not to come down from Atlanta today. She needed solitude to process her grief, time to figure out how to exist in a world where Marcus's steady presence no longer anchored her life. The doorbell rang again, followed by 3 sharp, impatient knocks that seemed to demand immediate attention. "Mrs. Washington? Mrs. Washington, I know you're in there. I can see your car in the driveway." The voice was unfamiliar, deep and rough around the edges, with a slight accent she couldn't quite place. Not Charleston Low Country, not Atlanta Georgian, something harder and more urban. Serena wrapped her silk robe tighter around her shoulders and padded barefoot down the curved staircase, her hand trailing along the polished mahogany banister that Marcus had restored himself during their first year in the house. Through the beveled glass panels beside the front door, she could make out the silhouette of a tall man in a dark suit. He looked official somehow, like a government agent or insurance investigator, the kind of person who brought unwelcome news about probate procedures and death benefits. She opened the door cautiously, keeping the security chain engaged. The man on her doorstep was younger than Marcus had been, maybe 42 or 43, with prematurely silver hair and intense brown eyes that seemed to catalog everything they saw. He was handsome in a dangerous way, with sharp cheekbones and a mouth that looked like it rarely smiled. His charcoal gray suit was expensive, Italian cut, and he carried a leather briefcase that probably cost more than most people's monthly mortgage payment. "Mrs. Washington," he said, pulling out a business card and holding it up so she could read it through the gap in the door. My name is David Chun. I was your husband's business partner. Serena stared at the card in confusion. Chun and Amp. Associates Financial Services, the elegant script proclaimed, with a downtown Charleston address she didn't recognize. In 18 years of marriage, Marcus had never mentioned a business partner named David Chun. Her husband was a surgeon, not a businessman. His only investments were a conservative portfolio managed by their longtime financial advisor at First Citizens Bank and 2 rental properties they owned jointly in the University District. I'm sorry, but I think you have the wrong house, she said, starting to close the door. My husband was a cardiac surgeon. He didn't have any business partners. David placed his hand against the door frame, not aggressively, but firmly enough to prevent her from shutting him out. Mrs. Washington, please. I understand this must be confusing, but there are some urgent matters we need to discuss regarding your husband's secondary investments, matters that directly affect your financial security. Secondary investments. The phrase made Serena's stomach tighten with unease. During the past 6 months, there had been subtle changes in Marcus's behavior that she had attributed to stress from his expanding surgical practice. He had been working later hours, taking mysterious phone calls that he conducted in private, and seemed distracted even during their quiet evenings at home. When she had asked about it, he had brushed off her concerns with reassurances about a new cardiac program he was helping to develop, additional responsibilities that were temporarily demanding more of his time and attention. She had believed him because she had always believed him, because in 18 years of marriage he had never given her reason to doubt his word. What kind of investments? Serena asked, her voice barely above a whisper. David glanced around nervously, as if he expected someone to be watching from the manicured gardens and expensive automobiles that lined their exclusive street. This isn't a conversation for your front doorstep, Mrs. Washington. May I come in? I promise you. What I have to tell you is something you need to hear. Every instinct screamed at Serena to say no, to call the police, to slam the door in this stranger's face and pretend this conversation had never happened. But the mention of financial matters involving Marcus had opened a door in her mind that she couldn't close. Over the past year, there had been small inconsistencies that hadn't made sense at the time. Expensive gifts that appeared without explanation, improvements to their investment portfolio that seemed too good to be true, Marcus's increasing reluctance to discuss their finances in detail. She had dismissed these concerns as the natural result of their growing wealth and Marcus's desire to handle the boring details of money management himself. But now, looking at David Chen's expectant face, she wondered if there had been more to her husband's financial affairs than she had ever imagined. Serena unhooked the security chain and stepped back to let David enter her home. He moved through her foyer and living room like a man appraising valuable property, his eyes sweeping over the museum-quality antiques, the original oil paintings that lined the walls, the Persian rugs that had been in Marcus's family for 3 generations. Everything in their home whispered of old money and older Charleston traditions, the kind of understated elegance that couldn't be bought, but had to be inherited or earned over decades of careful cultivation. Beautiful home, David said, settling onto the cream-colored silk sofa without waiting for an invitation to sit. Marcus always said you had exquisite taste. You knew my husband well. Serena remained standing, her arms crossed defensively over her chest. Well enough to know that he was deeply concerned about your future financial security. David opened his briefcase and extracted a thick manila folder. That's why he asked me to look after you if anything happened to him. The folder was labeled with Serena's full name in Marcus's familiar handwriting, Serena Elizabeth Washington, confidential, eyes only. Below it, in smaller letters that seemed to have been added more recently, to be opened in the event of my death. Serena felt her legs weaken. She sank into the queen and wingback chair that had been her favorite reading spot, her heart hammering against her ribs with a rhythm that reminded her uncomfortably of Marcus's medical monitors. What is this? She asked, her voice hoarse with sudden fear. Your husband's insurance policy, David said, sliding the folder across the antique coffee table that Marcus had bought for her 5th wedding anniversary. Marcus was involved in some very lucrative investment opportunities, Mrs. Washington. Opportunities that generated substantial returns, but also carried significant risks. Serena opened the folder with trembling fingers, her wedding ring catching the morning light streaming through the tall windows. Inside were documents she had never seen before: corporate filings, bank statements, investment agreements bearing Marcus's signature, and legal terminology she didn't understand. The numbers were staggering, almost incomprehensible. Millions of dollars moving in and out of accounts with names she didn't recognize, transactions that dwarfed their legitimate household income. "I don't understand," she whispered, her voice so quiet that David had to lean forward to hear her. Marcus was a cardiac surgeon. His income came from the hospital, his private practice, and a few consulting contracts with medical device companies. "We've always been comfortable, but this..." She gestured helplessly at the documents. "This suggests he was earning more money than the chief of cardiac surgery at Johns Hopkins." David's smile was patient but somehow condescending, like a teacher explaining a simple concept to a particularly slow student. "Your husband's medical income was impressive, Mrs. Washington, but it was a fraction of what he earned through his association with Chun and Amp Associates." Marcus had a remarkable talent for identifying and facilitating unique investment opportunities. Serena stared at the bank statements, her vision blurring as she tried to process the magnitude of what she was seeing. According to these documents, Marcus had been moving millions of dollars through various accounts for the past 3 years, money that had never appeared in their joint tax returns or personal financial statements. "Where did all this money come from?" she asked, though part of her already dreaded the answer. "Various sources," David replied vaguely, his tone suggesting that specifics were not particularly important. Marcus specialized in connecting investors with opportunities that weren't available through traditional financial institutions. High net worth individuals and organizations that needed discreet, efficient financial services. The euphemisms made Serena's skin crawl with a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. She might have been sheltered from the darker realities of the world by 18 years of marriage to a respected surgeon, but she wasn't naive. Discreet financial services, non-traditional investment opportunities, high net worth clients who needed anonymity. David was describing money laundering operations. "My husband was washing dirty money," she said flatly, the words falling into the elegant room like stones into still water. David's expression didn't change, but she caught the slight tightening around his eyes that suggested she had identified the situation more accurately than he had intended. "Your husband was providing legitimate financial services to clients who valued privacy above all else." The distinction may seem subtle to someone outside the industry, but it's legally and ethically significant. "Don't lie to me," Serena said, her voice gaining strength as anger began to burn through the fog of grief and confusion. "I may not have a business degree, but I'm not stupid. These documents show Marcus moving money in patterns that are designed to obscure its origins. That's not investment management, that's money laundering." She stood up abruptly, pacing to the tall windows that overlooked the formal garden Marcus had spent years perfecting. Outside, the September morning was bright and warm, with tourists already beginning their walking tours of the historic district. The normalcy of the scene, couples taking photographs, children chasing pigeons, elderly visitors reading historical markers, seemed to belong to a different universe than the one where she was learning that her husband had been a criminal. "How long?" she asked without turning around. "How long what, Mrs. Washington? How long was Marcus involved in this business?" David consulted the documents in the folder. "The first transactions we facilitated for your husband were in April 2020, so approximately 3.5 years. Serena pressed her forehead against the cool glass of the window, trying to remember what had been happening in their lives 3.5 years ago. Marcus had been promoted to chief of cardiovascular surgery that spring, a position that came with significant administrative responsibilities and a corresponding increase in stress. She had attributed his increasing distraction and longer work hours to the pressures of his new role. But there had been other changes too, now that she thought about it with the bitter clarity of hindsight. Expensive gifts that appeared without explanation, jewelry, artwork, a vintage Porsche that Marcus claimed he had gotten as a trade-in from a grateful patient. Improvements to their investment portfolio that their financial advisor couldn't quite explain. Lavish vacations that seemed more expensive than what they could afford, even with Marcus's impressive surgical income. "Why?" she asked, still facing the window. We were comfortable financially. Marcus's practice was thriving. We owned property. We had everything we needed. Why would he get involved in something like this? The silence stretched for so long that Serena finally turned around. David was studying her with an expression that might have been pity. Mrs. Washington, he said finally, how much do you know about your husband's gambling activities? The question hit her like a physical blow. Serena gripped the back of the nearest chair, her knees suddenly unsteady. Gambling activities? What gambling activities? David reached into the folder and pulled out another set of documents, credit card statements, bank records, receipts from casinos as far away as Las Vegas and Atlantic City. The numbers were devastating. Hundreds of thousands of dollars lost on sports betting, poker games, even online gambling sites that Serena had never heard of. Marcus had been betting for years, David said gently. By the time he came to us for help, he owed nearly $2 million to various bookmakers and loan sharks, people who don't accept late payments or negotiate payment plans. Serena felt the room spinning around her. She lowered herself back into the chair, her hands shaking as she stared at the evidence of her husband's secret addiction. The dates on the gambling receipt stretched back to their early years of marriage, suggesting that Marcus had been living a double life for over a decade. I had no idea, she whispered. He never. He occasionally bought lottery tickets or bet on the Super Bowl, but nothing serious. Certainly nothing like this. Gambling addiction is a progressive disease, Mrs. Washington. It typically starts small and escalates over time. Marcus was very good at hiding it, compartmentalizing his losses, and maintaining his professional and personal responsibilities. But eventually, the debts became too large to manage through conventional means. David leaned forward, his expression growing more serious. That's when Chun and Amp, associates, offered Marcus a solution. We would clear his gambling debts in exchange for his cooperation in facilitating certain financial transactions. It was supposed to be temporary, just until he could regain his financial footing. But it wasn't temporary, Serena said, already understanding the trap her husband had walked into. These arrangements rarely are. Marcus was very good at what we asked him to do. His reputation as a respected surgeon, his connections in Charleston's medical and social communities, his access to sophisticated financial institutions, all of these made him extremely valuable to our clients. Serena felt nauseous as the full implications began to sink in. Marcus hadn't just been laundering money. He had been using their home, their social connections, their carefully cultivated reputation as cover for criminal activities. Every dinner party they had hosted, every charity event they had attended, every moment of their public life together had potentially been part of an elaborate deception designed to legitimize dirty money. You said he was concerned about my financial security, she managed to say. What did you mean? David's expression grew grave. Mrs. Washington, your husband didn't die of a heart attack. The words seemed to echo in the suddenly airless room. Serena felt herself falling, the elegant living room dissolving into fragments of color and light as her world tilted off its axis. The autopsy said congenital heart defect, she gasped. The medical examiner was very specific. The medical examiner said what he was told to say, David interrupted. Marcus was murdered, Mrs. Washington, by people who discovered that he had been skimming money from the accounts he was supposed to be cleaning. Serena gripped the arms of her chair until her knuckles turned white, fighting against the wave of nausea and vertigo that threatened to overwhelm her. How much money? For $0.7 million. The number hit her like a sledgehammer. Serena doubled over, her breath coming in short gasps as she struggled to process what she was hearing. Marcus hadn't just been killed. He had been murdered for stealing nearly $5 million from criminals who wouldn't hesitate to kill anyone who stood in their way, including his widow. What do they want from me? She managed to ask through the ringing in her ears. They want their money back, plus interest and penalties for the inconvenience Marcus caused. $8.5 million, to be exact. David's voice was gentle but implacable. They don't care that Marcus is dead. The debt transfers to his estate, which means it transfers to you. Serena looked around the living room that had been her sanctuary for 15 years, calculating the value of everything she could see. The house was worth perhaps $2 million, the furnishings and artwork another 500,000. Marcus's life insurance policy would pay out another 1.5 million. Even if she liquidated everything they owned, she would barely have half of what these people were demanding. I don't have $8.5 million, she said, her voice hollow with despair. I know, David replied, but there might be another way to resolve this situation. Serena looked up sharply. What kind of way? Chun and Amp. Associates is always looking for qualified individuals to take over the responsibilities of former associates. Someone with the right background, the right connections, the right skill set. David studied her face carefully. Someone like you. You want me to become a money launderer. I want to offer you a way to survive this, Serena. These people don't negotiate, and they don't forgive debts. If you can't pay what Marcus owed, they'll kill you. It's that simple. The threat hung in the air between them like a physical presence. Serena thought about her sister Denise in Atlanta, about her teenage nephews who spent summers in Charleston and called her Aunt Serena, about the life insurance money that was supposed to provide financial security for her future, about the medical foundation she had hoped to establish in Marcus's memory. All of it would be meaningless if she was dead. But the thought of taking Marcus's place, of continuing his criminal activities under the threat of violence, filled her with revulsion. She had spent her adult life building a reputation as a respected member of Charleston society, serving on charity boards, organizing fundraisers for the Children's Hospital, hosting elegant dinner parties that were photographed for Southern Living magazine. I need time to think, she said finally. David stood and straightened his expensive tie. You have 72 hours, Mrs. Washington. I'll come back on Thursday morning for your decision. He paused at the front door and looked back at her with what might have been genuine sympathy. For what it's worth, I'm sorry for your loss. Marcus spoke about you often. He loved you very much. If he loved me, he wouldn't have put me in this position, Serena replied, her voice empty of emotion. After David left, Serena sat alone in her living room, surrounded by the evidence of her husband's betrayal. The afternoon light streaming through the tall windows illuminated the manila folder like a spotlight, forcing her to confront truths she had been avoiding for years. Marcus had been living a lie, not just for the past 3.5 years, but potentially for most of their marriage. The gambling addiction that David described didn't develop overnight. It was a progressive disease that would have shown symptoms long before it reached the desperate levels that drove him to seek help from money launderers. How many signs had she missed? How many times had she chosen to believe convenient explanations rather than asking uncomfortable questions? How many years had she been married to a stranger? Over the next 2 days, Serena searched for answers with the methodical precision of someone conducting her own investigation. She went through Marcus's home office with forensic attention to detail, looking for clues that might explain his descent into criminality and help her understand the full scope of the dangers she now faced. What she found was even worse than she had imagined. Hidden behind medical textbooks in Marcus's private study, she discovered a second set of financial records that painted a very different picture of their marriage than the one she had been living. The rental properties they supposedly owned free and clear were actually heavily mortgaged, bleeding money rather than generating the passive income they had been counting on for retirement. Marcus's private practice, which she had assumed was thriving based on his public reputation, was actually struggling financially, losing patients to younger surgeons with more modern equipment and lower fees. Most devastating of all, she found evidence that the gambling addiction stretched back much further than David had indicated. Credit card statements and bank records hidden in a locked drawer revealed that Marcus had been borrowing against their home equity, their retirement accounts, even her personal inheritance from her grandmother to fund his betting activities. By the time he had started working with Chun and Amp associates, he wasn't just gambling with their financial future. He had already mortgaged it. But she also found something else, something that would change everything she thought she understood about her husband's death and her current situation. Wedged behind the false back of Marcus's desk drawer was a letter addressed to her, written in his familiar handwriting and dated just 2 weeks before his death. My darling Serena. It began the formal endearment he had used in love letters throughout their courtship. If you are reading this, then David Chun has kept his promise to deliver these documents to you, and something has happened to me. I know you must hate me now, and I don't blame you. I have destroyed everything we built together, and I have put you in terrible danger. Serena's hands trembled as she read her husband's confession, each word a dagger to her heart. The letter confirmed everything David had told her about the gambling addiction and the money laundering, but it also revealed details that painted Marcus as more victim than perpetrator. I never meant for any of this to happen, Marcus continued. The gambling started in medical school as a way to relieve stress during finals week. Just small bets on basketball games, nothing that seemed dangerous or addictive. But it grew over the years, especially during my residency when the pressure was so intense and I had so little control over anything else in my life. The letter explained how Marcus had managed to hide his losses during their early years of marriage by borrowing against his future earnings potential, convinced that his surgical career would eventually generate enough income to pay off his debts. But as his gambling escalated, so did his losses, until he found himself trapped in a cycle of borrowing money to chase previous losses. By the time I became chief of cardiovascular surgery, I owed nearly $3 million to bookmakers and loan sharks who were beginning to make threats against both of us, Marcus wrote. That's when David Chun approached me with what seemed like a solution. Chun and Amp, associates, would clear my debts in exchange for my cooperation in moving money through accounts that I would establish using my professional credentials and social connections. Serena felt sick as she realized that David Chen hadn't been trying to help Marcus. He had been recruiting him. The timing of Chen's approach, coming just when Marcus's debts had reached crisis levels, suggested that the money laundering organization had been monitoring his gambling activities and waiting for the perfect moment to make their offer. I thought I could control the situation, Marcus continued. I thought I could fulfill my obligations to Chun and Amp, associates, and then gradually extricate myself from their operations. But these people don't let you walk away, Serena. Once you're in their system, you're in for life. The letter revealed that Marcus had been trying to escape from Chun and Amp, associates, for months, gradually reducing his involvement while building evidence that he hoped to use to protect himself if the situation deteriorated further. But his efforts had been discovered, and he knew his life was in danger. I've been skimming money from their accounts, Marcus admitted. Not for greed or personal gain, but as an insurance policy. I've hidden $5.2 million in offshore accounts that only you can access. It's more than enough to pay back what I took from them, but it might also be enough to buy your freedom if you're smart about how you use it. Serena's eyes widened as she read the detailed instructions Marcus had left for accessing the hidden money, along with the names and contact information of other people who had tried to leave Chin and Amp, associates. Most of them, Marcus noted grimly, had died under suspicious circumstances that were ruled accidental or medical by coroners who had been paid to avoid asking uncomfortable questions. I should have told you the truth years ago, the letter concluded. I should have been brave enough to face the consequences of my addiction instead of dragging you into this nightmare. I love you more than life itself, Serena, but love wasn't enough to save me from my own weakness. Maybe it will be enough to save you. Serena read the letter 3 times before the full implications began to sink in. Marcus hadn't been the helpless victim of circumstances that David Chen had portrayed. He had been actively working to escape from the money laundering organization and protect her from the consequences of his mistakes. The $5 million David claimed Marcus had stolen might not have been theft at all, but a carefully planned extraction of funds that Marcus intended to use as leverage against his captors. More importantly, the letter suggested that David Chun might not be the sympathetic business partner he pretended to be. If Marcus had been skimming money and planning his escape for months, then David would have known about it. The story about discovering the theft after Marcus's death was a lie, which meant everything else David had told her was suspect, including the amount of money she supposedly owed. Serena spent Wednesday evening researching Chun and Amp, Associates Financial Services, online, using the investigative skills she had developed during her brief career in pharmaceutical sales. What she found both terrified and enlightened her. Chun and Amp, Associates wasn't just a money laundering operation. It was a sophisticated criminal enterprise with tentacles reaching throughout the Southeast. They specialized in recruiting professionals with impeccable reputations who could provide legitimacy to their operations: doctors, lawyers, accountants, business owners who found themselves financially vulnerable and susceptible to blackmail. The pattern was always the same. Chun and Amp, associates would identify targets who were struggling with gambling addiction, tax problems, or other financial difficulties. They would approach these individuals with offers to solve their immediate problems in exchange for cooperation in moving money through legitimate appearing accounts. Once someone was compromised, they became permanent assets of the organization, unable to extricate themselves without facing criminal prosecution or violent retaliation. But Serena also discovered something that gave her the first glimmer of hope she had felt since David Chin knocked on her door. Several news articles from different cities described successful prosecutions of money laundering organizations that had collapsed after key witnesses agreed to cooperate with federal authorities. In each case, the testimony of professionals who had been coerced into participating had provided the evidence necessary to dismantle entire criminal networks. Marcus hadn't just been planning his own escape. He had been preparing to bring down Chun and Amp, associates entirely. On Thursday morning, Serena dressed carefully in a navy blue business suit and her grandmother's pearl necklace, the uniform of a successful widow conducting her late husband's affairs. She styled her hair in an elegant French twist and applied makeup with a steady hand, preparing for the most important performance of her life. She had spent the previous evening making phone calls, some to old friends in the pharmaceutical industry who now worked for federal law enforcement agencies, others to attorneys who specialized in white-collar criminal defense. By the time David Chin arrived for their scheduled meeting, Serena had assembled a comprehensive understanding of her options and their probable outcomes. David knocked at precisely 10 o'clock, as punctual as an undertaker. Serena opened the door without the security chain, greeting him with the kind of gracious smile that had made her one of Charleston's most sought-after hostesses. "Mr. Chun," she said, stepping back to allow him to enter. "Thank you for being so patient with my grieving process. Please come in. I've prepared coffee and some of those biscuits you complimented yesterday." If David was surprised by her improved mood and apparent composure, he didn't show it. He settled into his usual spot on the cream-colored sofa, while Serena served coffee from her grandmother's silver service, the picture of Southern hospitality. "I hope you've had time to consider our discussion," David said, accepting the delicate china cup with the polite appreciation of a man who recognized quality when he saw it. "I have," Serena replied, taking the seat across from him with the calm demeanor of someone who had made peace with difficult circumstances. "And I've made my decision." David leaned forward expectantly, his briefcase positioned beside his chair like a weapon ready to be deployed. "I've decided to accept your offer," Serena said. "I want to take over Marcus's responsibilities with Chun and Amp, associates." David's smile was triumphant, but not surprised. "I think that's a wise choice, Mrs. Washington. You have exactly the kind of background and connections that would be valuable to our clients. Your reputation in Charleston society, your involvement with various charitable organizations, your social relationships with other professionals and business leaders, all of these assets would make you extremely effective in your new role." "I'm glad you approve," Serena said, "but I have some conditions." David's expression grew more cautious. "What kind of conditions?" "First, I want to understand exactly what happened to Marcus. Not the sanitized version you gave me on Tuesday, but the complete truth about why he was killed and who made that decision." "Mrs. Washington." Second, Serena continued as if he hadn't spoken, "I want full disclosure about the money Marcus supposedly stole and where it went. The numbers you gave me don't match the financial records I've found in his office." David set down his coffee cup with enough force to rattle the delicate china. "Serena, you're asking questions that aren't relevant to your future with our organization. On the contrary, they're extremely relevant." Serena opened the antique secretary desk in the corner of the room and returned with a thick folder. "Because they help me understand why you've been lying to me since the moment you walked through my door." She dropped the folder on the coffee table between them with enough impact to make David flinch. "I also found my husband's letter explaining everything, David, including his plans to testify against Chun and Amp, associates in exchange for federal protection." David's face went pale, his carefully maintained composure cracking like a mask. "What letter?" The letter where Marcus confessed to stealing $5.2 million from Chun and AMP, associates accounts. Not $4.7 million, as you told me. And not stolen for personal gain, but as evidence to use against your organization. Serena opened the folder to reveal copies of bank statements, recorded conversations, and surveillance photographs that Marcus had collected over months of careful documentation. Marcus wasn't just planning to escape from your organization, David. He was planning to destroy it completely. And based on the evidence he collected, he probably would have succeeded. David stood up abruptly, his hands shaking as he reached for his briefcase. You don't understand what you're dealing with, Serena. These people don't just kill witnesses. They kill entire families to make sure no one ever considers betraying them again. I understand perfectly, Serena replied, her voice calm despite the racing of her heart. I understand that Chun and AMP Associates has been operating a criminal enterprise that has destroyed dozens of lives over the past decade. I understand that you murdered my husband to prevent him from exposing your operations. And I understand that you came here not to help me, but to recruit me as Marcus's replacement. She walked to the window overlooking the formal garden, the same window where she had stood 2 days earlier learning about Marcus's gambling addiction. What I don't understand is why you thought I would be stupid enough to fall for your performance. David was backing toward the front door, his briefcase clutched against his chest like a shield. What do you want, Serena? I want justice for my husband, and I want to make sure that no one else dies because of Chun and AMP associates. Serena picked up her phone from the side table and speed dialed a number she had memorized the previous evening. Special Agent Catherine Morrison? This is Serena Washington. I believe you're expecting my call. David lunged toward her, trying to grab the phone from her hand, but Serena stepped smoothly aside with the grace of someone who had spent years navigating crowded charity receptions. Agent Morrison, I have someone here you'll want to meet. David Chin of Chun and AMP, Associates Financial Services. He's been very helpful in confirming the information my late husband provided to your office. Serena, hang up the phone, David demanded, his professional composure completely gone. You don't know what you're doing. These people will kill everyone you've ever cared about. These people are about to be arrested, Serena replied, covering the phone with her hand. Marcus spent 8 months building an airtight case against Chun and AMP Associates. Financial records, recorded conversations, photographic surveillance, detailed documentation of every aspect of your money laundering operations, everything the FBI needs to shut you down permanently. She removed her hand from the phone and spoke to Agent Morrison. David seems very eager to leave now, but I think he'll be much more comfortable staying here until your agents arrive. The sound of sirens grew louder outside as federal law enforcement vehicles converged on the historic district mansion. David ran to the tall windows, watching in horror as FBI agents in bulletproof vests took positions around the house with the precision of a military operation. You set me up, he said, his voice hollow with the realization of complete defeat. Marcus set you up, Serena corrected. I'm just following the instructions he left in case something happened to him. The front door burst open and federal agents flooded into the elegant living room, their weapons drawn and voices shouting commands that seemed to echo off the high ceilings and antique furnishings. David Chun was handcuffed and read his rights while still protesting his innocence to agents who had heard similar denials from dozens of other criminals. Special Agent Catherine Morrison, a compact woman with silver-streaked hair and intelligent brown eyes, approached Serena with a mixture of professional respect and personal sympathy that suggested she had extensive experience dealing with the families of crime victims. Mrs. Washington, I want to thank you for your courage in following through with your husband's plans. The evidence he provided has allowed us to obtain arrest warrants for 37 members of the Chun and AMP Associates organization. Will it be enough to convict them? Serena asked, watching through the window as David was placed in the back of a federal vehicle. More than enough. We've been investigating money laundering operations in the Southeast for 5 years, but we could never get close enough to gather the kind of inside evidence we needed. Your husband's documentation has given us everything we need to dismantle not just Chun and AMP Associates, but several other criminal organizations they worked with. Agent Morrison paused, studying Serena's composed expression with the analytical gaze of someone trained to read people under stress. I have to ask, Mrs. Washington, did you know about your husband's activities before his death? Serena considered the question carefully. The truth was complicated, layered with self-deception and willful blindness that would take months of therapy to fully understand. Marcus had been both victim and criminal, both hero and coward. She had been both innocent wife and willful accomplice who had chosen not to ask uncomfortable questions about their increasingly lavish lifestyle. I knew my husband was in trouble, she said finally. I knew he was frightened and desperate and trying to find a way out of a situation that had spiraled beyond his control. I knew he loved me enough to risk his life trying to protect me from the consequences of his mistakes. And the money he extracted from Chin and Amp, associates' accounts, will be returned to the federal government and used to compensate other victims of money laundering operations, Serena replied without hesitation. Marcus would have wanted his final actions to help repair some of the damage he had helped cause. Agent Morrison nodded approvingly. We'll need you to testify when this case goes to trial, probably sometime next spring. Are you prepared for that level of public scrutiny? Serena looked around the living room where she had learned the truth about her marriage, where she had made the decision to honor her husband's final wishes rather than save herself through continued criminality. The elegant furnishings and expensive artwork suddenly seemed like props in someone else's play, beautiful but meaningless without the love that had once filled this space. Agent Morrison, she said, I've been living a lie for 18 years. Public scrutiny doesn't frighten me anymore. 6 months later, Serena Washington stood in the garden of her King Street mansion, watching as professional movers loaded the last of her furniture into trucks bound for Atlanta. She had decided to start over somewhere new, somewhere without the ghost of a marriage that had been built on secrets and sustained by willful denial. The house would be sold, with the proceeds used to establish the Marcus Washington Foundation for Addiction Treatment and Recovery. It seemed like a fitting memorial to her husband, using the profits from his criminal activities to help other people avoid the devastating choices that had destroyed his life and endangered hers. The federal trials had been a media sensation, with Serena's testimony helping to convict David Chun and 23 other members of his money laundering network. The organization had been completely dismantled, its assets seized and distributed to victims of their crimes. David Chun himself had been sentenced to 25 years in federal prison, where he would have plenty of time to consider the price of his criminal ambitions. Marcus's murder would never be officially acknowledged. The FBI had needed to maintain the fiction of his natural death to protect their investigation and ensure the safety of other witnesses. But Serena knew the truth, and that was enough. Her husband had died trying to make amends for his mistakes, and his sacrifice had probably saved dozens of other lives. As the moving trucks pulled away from the curb, Serena took one final look at the house where she had lived the last 18 years of her life. She felt no sadness, no nostalgia for the elegant dinner parties and perfect family image that had masked such profound deception. She felt only relief that the performance was finally over. The taxi that would take her to the airport was already waiting. Serena climbed into the back seat with a single suitcase that contained everything she needed for her new life, leaving behind the material remnants of a marriage that had been equal parts love story and criminal conspiracy. As they drove through the historic streets of Charleston toward the airport, she thought about Marcus's final letter, about the love and guilt that had driven him to such desperate measures. He had been right about one thing. Love hadn't been enough to save him from his own weakness, but it had been enough to give him the courage to try to save her, even at the cost of his own life. Serena Washington was starting over at 44, with nothing but her integrity and the hard-won knowledge that she was stronger than she had ever imagined. She had survived the ultimate betrayal and emerged with her moral compass intact, ready to build a life based on truth rather than convenient deceptions. For the first time in years, the future stretched ahead of her like an open road, full of possibilities she had never allowed herself to consider when she was busy being the perfect surgeon's wife. Marcus was gone, but Serena was finally completely free to discover who she really was when she wasn't pretending to be someone else. The plane lifted off from Charleston International Airport as the sun set over the low country, carrying her toward a new life built on the foundation of hard-earned wisdom and unshakable strength. Behind her lay 18 years of marriage to a man she had loved but never really known. Ahead lay whatever she chose to make of the time she had remaining, time that belonged entirely to her.